sort these things out before you get all your marks and stuff, which gives you a more accurate idea of how well you've done it. So anyway, we'll see if we can get the percentage done. You can
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Michael, you all set?
Yeah.
Sorry, no, that was...
I'm keeping myself away.
Oh, geez. Good morning, everybody. Today is week 9, and we're going to be looking at alternative media, or as the subtitle was for this week, the idea of we are everywhere. Now, first, I just want to say I'm trying something a bit different this week. I did not, like my first lecture, write the whole lecture out verbatim. So I'm going to be winging it a little bit. I decided to just do talking points and see how it goes. It could go well, it could go terribly. So I'm not 100% sure how this is going to go, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit. All right, today I want to divide this lecture up pretty much into roughly 3 sections. In the readings this week, as you probably noticed, there was sort of a dualistic discussion between alternative media and this idea of ethnic media, as well as you'll probably have noticed that a lot of the points that are being discussed, a lot of the different organizations that are discussed, tend to be fairly left-wing. Near the end of the lecture, I'd like to talk a bit more about grassroots media that falls a bit more on the right-wing side. But the 3 main areas that I want to talk about are this idea of what is alternative media, try to give you some working definitions of what that is. Then I would like to look a bit, because my personal interest in academia started out as history. I was a history major originally, so I always tend to look at these things from a historical perspective. So I'd like to give you a bit of background on the history of alternative media, how we got to where we are today. And then I'd like to look at some of the new media players as to this idea of what makes alternative media now, and why alternative media is important as well. And then lastly, and this isn't really 3 parts, this is sort of a addendum, I'm going to leave you with a YouTube clip that I saw last night when I was looking for some of the information for the Prezi that I thought was really interesting. And it was a really interesting example of how alternative media works in a very practical sense. It comes from the Occupy Wall Street movement, or rather, it's a commentary on the Occupy Wall Street movement. So, I guess the first question, as I said, we would be talking about is what is alternative media? Now, according to Dowling, Dowling argues that if alternative media has one thing in common, it's that they break somebody's rules, although rarely all of them in every respect. Now, I gave a very basic definition as alternative media in its most very basic sense, that basically a talking point would be that it can be defined as media which is outside of the mainstream. Now, for this purpose, I would argue that the mainstream in media is going to be bodies such as News Corp, Viacom, as well as the main public service broadcasters that we've talked about, such as the BBC in the United Kingdom, ARD in Germany, Antenne 1 TV France, stuff like that. They, I would consider to be mainstream news. What Dowling is basically arguing, though, when he talks about alternative media, is people and groups who are placing themselves outside of this mainstream. Now, in some cases, this has to do with the message that they're conveying. It has to do either with an alternative discourse to a given message that's being put out on a regular basis, or it has to do with a message that isn't even being discussed. For example, just by a show of hands, can anybody think of an issue that the mainstream press doesn't really discuss very often?
No hands.
No hands. Okay, I'll go to my captive audience. Tutors and Michael. Anything you can think of that isn't covered on a regular basis?
The mundane everyday life.
Okay. Yeah. Everyday issues.
The criminal activities of capitalists.
Aha! That's a good point. The criminal activities of capitalists. Now, I can think of one right off the top of my head, something that was not being covered by mainstream media until it became scandalous that it wasn't covering it, and that's the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Occupy Wall Street movement, just as as an introductory example, was not being covered by the mainstream press in New York City when the protests started in the second week of September. There was an almost glaring media silence towards the Occupy Wall Street movement. I first found out about it myself on Facebook, which in and of itself is a form of alternative media, and we'll talk more about that later. But the point is that the mainstream media in this case was not discussing this story. On the other hand, there was a lot of controversy simultaneously. The fact that if the Tea Party movement in the United States held a rally that drew 20 people, it would be front page news. But yet the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was drawing 2,000 people at its very first ideation, would literally not get any press coverage. And a question I'd like you to think about is why? Why would one get press coverage and one not? So that's just something to think about. So, as I had said, Dowling I quoted before as saying, if alternative media have one thing in common, it's that they break somebody's rules, although really all of them in every respect. Now, what's interesting about alternative media is that they don't hold themselves to the same structures that we've been talking about within looking at things like journalistic ethics, as well as looking at the idea of gatekeepers, as we've talked about, as being sort of this mediator between the public on one side and the government, and I guess you could also say corporate bodies on the other. Alternative media is not held back by these same limitations, but it also does not fall under those same safeguards. When you're dealing with alternative media, you have to be aware of the fact that things like bias, I would say also things such as veracity, they're not as strictly maintained. And I would argue that that has something to do both with the fact that we're not dealing with a professional, for the most part, a professional journalistic class, as we are when we're dealing with the mainstream media. And I would also argue that it has to do with the fact that we're dealing with people who are very passionate about their issues versus the idea that journalists are supposed to be dispassionate and disinvolved reporters. They're supposed to report on the news, not make the news. And that's something else that we'll talk about further on in this lecture, is this idea of a blurring between news reporters and news makers. Now, Silverstone talks about alternative media as being able to create new spaces for alternative voices that provide the focus both for specific community interests as well as for the contrary and the subversive. This falls into the idea that Habermas talks about, and also looking at some of the ideas that Nancy Fraser talk about in regards to the public sphere. In Habermas's classic ideation of the public sphere, you would literally have a set of the media as the initial idea was that it's more of a monolithic block around which you had the concerned private on one side, and then you had the government on the other. However, as Nancy Fraser pointed out, when she began to make critiques of Habermas, especially of the Habermasian idea that when issues of the private life were being brought out into the public sphere, according to Habermas, this caused the public sphere to undergo what he drew from the title of his work, structural transformation. And his argument is that this structural transformation actually caused a beginning of a degeneration of the public sphere. Well, Nancy Fraser took a very contrarian approach to this, a very contrarian argument. And she argued that rather than causing it a degradation of the public sphere, it actually caused an expansion of it. And she discusses an idea, which I didn't put in the slides, but I probably should have, this idea of subaltern public spheres. And basically what she means by that is that within one large overarching public sphere, that there are smaller publics. And those publics have very specific interests. And it's those smaller publics that alternative media, and what Silverstone is getting at here, this idea of the contrary, the subversive, specific community interests, it's this idea of subaltern public spheres that one could argue that alternative media is appealing to. Another side of this argument that will come out through this lecture as I talk is the fact that alternative media is very much technologically driven. The fact is that we are moving away, and we have been moving away for approximately the past 30 years, from a single point source broadcasting model or a single source of information model where you have a technological limitation of, in some cases, literally the capital infrastructure of a printing press or the capital infrastructure of a broadcasting mast towards a multinodal network of communication. And it's due to this that you see this, we're seeing a rise in the ability and in the quantity of alternative media within the public sphere. This is sort of paraphrased a bit by Atton, who states that alternative media radically reforms key aspects of communication: skills, capitalization, and controls. And this is sort of what I was getting at. The key aspects, I've already mentioned skills, where I talked about this idea of a journalistic class. Capitalization, when we talk about the actual capital, both social capital as well as physical capital, and control. Now that gets into the idea of gatekeepers again that we've been talking about throughout term. This idea that we, within the public, rely on journalists to act as gatekeepers. So what I want you to take from the theoretical side of this argument is that the alternative media stands apart from the mainstream media. Another remark that I came across basically talks about the alternative media acting as well in conjunction. It stands apart, but it also acts in conjunction with the mainstream media. And it acts as an expansion of the public sphere. It acts as an expansion of the information that we need, going back to this democratic ideal again, that we need to use within the public sphere to come to some sort of democratic consensus. Now, whoa. Hello.
It's the rebellion of the alternative.
Yes, it's also the rebellion of technology. All right, hold on one second. All right, we'll start with, let me just move that out of the way. Okay. There we go. That's what I like about Prezi, is the fact that I can just go in there and change it right away. And it means then that, you know, I don't have a completely ruined 2 slides and you'd have me going, Okay. So the first article that you would have looked at this week talked quite a bit about this idea of ethnic media. Now, something that's very interesting about this idea is that people tend to think that ethnic media is automatically falls under these ideas, or has automatically fallen under these ideas of alternative media, as in being not sponsored by a journalistic class or a journalistic profession, shall we say, or that it falls under this idea of being less polished, etc., etc. That's actually not really the case. What really makes ethnic media alternative is that, again, it's fitting a niche that is not being met by the mainstream media. In this case, it's looking at non-mainstream ethnicities within a given country. To use an example, again, that I'm familiar with, both from a historical point of view and a nationalistic point of view, in the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, most major cities had more than one daily newspaper that was not printed in English. For example, the city where I'm from, as those of you who have me know, I'm from that wonderful land of Family Guy, Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, we had a very large Italian community, and we've had printed in Rhode Island, we used to have a daily that was called the Providence Observer. And it was actually the Italian word for observer. I think it's observatore, but I don't, if that's wrong, anybody here who speaks Italian, if I'm wrong, please, you can correct me. No? No Italian speakers. Good. But yeah, that had been printed on a daily basis. It's only been in the past 30 years that it's gone to being a weekly. So, but that's still an alternative. The main newspaper where I'm from, Providence Journal, is the primary newspaper in that area. The Observatore would be considered an alternative media. But it's an ethnic media because it's targeted towards a foreign language clientele. It's also usually self-created, in that it's created either within the community, within a small group. In the case of they're not finding that their needs are being met, or as Thisu talks about, the way Thisu was arguing it is that they weren't finding their needs met because it's a rather exclusive, white, Western, male-dominated, and capitalistic domain. Now, here in the UK, you see this on a regular basis. There are community newsletters in almost every major city in the United Kingdom that's targeting different groups, that are targeting different language groups, different ethnicity groups. Can anybody think of a particular ethnicity group that maybe has recently in the United Kingdom started issuing their own newsletters within, I'd say, the past 10 years? Anybody think of any? Where's there been a big upsurge in immigration from, particularly when the economy was good? Thank you. That's exactly the one I was looking for. There's been a large rise in Polish newsletters in the United Kingdom because with the entrance of Poland into the full EU membership with full working rights all throughout the 27 EU states, as well as a booming British economy in the early thousands, the Polish community in Britain, I want to say the statistic I saw was quadrupled. And in that quadrupling, there was a niche that formed, and that niche was for Polish language media. And Polish language media exploded. Now it's actually, interestingly enough, beginning to go down again. Because for two very important reasons. One is that the Polish population is dropping. Net migration has almost ended, and net immigration No. Switch that around. Net immigration of Polish people has gone down, whereas net migration has risen. The Polish population is dropping. So one of the things that comes up about ethnic media as well is that in certain environments it can be very transitory. It can exist for a certain amount of time and then disappear. Going back to my example in Rhode Island, in my own community, there was the Italian newspaper. There was the Jewish Daily Herald, which was printed originally in Yiddish and was switched to English in the 1930s, and now no longer exists. It went away in the 60s due to assimilation, mostly. There were newspapers in Portuguese, and then there's been one in Hmong, Hmong, not Vietnamese, all of which have come and gone as these communities have assimilated. Now, according to the European Manifesto of Minority Community Media are often local. Sometimes they're regional or national initiatives. They provide their audience with essential information in their own language where appropriate, helping them to participate as equal citizens in their country of residence. They provide a platform for discussion and exchange with the minority communities as well as between the minority communities and the majority communities. They act as a bridge. They act as the ability for everyone to participate fully within the public sphere, theoretically to participate fully within the public sphere, because there are limitations. If, for example, a publication is in a foreign language to the one that your country is in, it means that you're only going to have a very limited audience. And this is a problem of alternative media in general, because if you think about the idea of language, there's also language and then there's also dialogue. You can have foreign language and you can also have foreign dialogue on the other side. Foreign languages won't be read by the majority language. Foreign dialogue, if you're not using the terminology and not using the buzzwords or the keywords that the majority or mainstream media is looking at, your information may go unnoticed. So there is a downside to this idea of alternative media and this idea of ethnic media, because for as much as they strive to try to broaden access to the public sphere, broaden access to information, they have the simultaneous problem of actually doing the exact opposite. All right, I want to see, aha. This quote was supposed to be with that other slide. It somehow got disconnected. I'll upload this Prezi, by the way, so don't feel like you have to write down all these different quotes. I wanted to mention this before, so it's a bit out of order. Throughout the history of ethnic media, one can see patterns of growing dissatisfaction with mainstream media, a distinct sense of crisis, an increased sense of civic engagement among the minority groups involved. Now, one of the positive things about this that I didn't mention is that it engenders this idea of community participation, of people wanting to be involved. It goes directly against what the mainstream media regularly tries to portray, particularly if you look at ethnic communities in the United Kingdom, that they live insular lives, or that they want to live insular lives, that they want to engage in ghettoization, and that they want to maintain their own completely separated identities. What ethnic media, in essence, does is it challenges that. The problem is, and it's a problem that will come up repeatedly, or that should be coming up repeatedly throughout my discussion, is the ability for alternative or ethnic media to be able to be heard against the constant onslaught of mainstream media. I was watching QI yesterday, and I learned something quite interesting. There's an astronomical principle called a black body. Anybody know what that means? What is an astronomical black body? Anybody know? You don't have to know for this lecture. An astronomical black body is a body that reflects, or a black body index rather, because it's measured in an index, is a body that reflects, it's a measure of reflection. And a black body, in an astronomical term, is a body that reflects no visible radiation. Now, there's only one black body in our solar system. Anybody know what it is?
The sun.
Exactly. Did you watch QI? Or? Yeah. The only black body in our solar system is the sun. And the reason why it's a black body is because no matter how bright the light you shine at the sun, it will not reflect back at you. Because the energy that comes out of the sun is so overwhelming that you just can't see your light for its light, through its light rather. And that's how I'd like you to think about this idea in some sense of alternative media versus mainstream media. Or to put it another way, it would be like trying to play a kazoo in front of a speaker rack at a rock concert. No one would hear your bloody kazoo. Now, that's not to say, I think that both of these metaphors probably seem very cynical and very much like, well, why the heck do we bother? I don't want to convey that. What I more want to convey is the challenge that these bodies have. The challenge that these bodies have to try to overcome this black body resistance, this overwhelming sense of commercialism, of media message that's being driven. For example, the reading talks about the pervasiveness of the Disney empire. You know, how does one resist this idea of the Disney empire, for example? Okay. All right. Now, going back to this idea of alternative media more directly, and keep in mind, from this point, we're kind of talking about both alternative media and ethnic media from here on in. I wanted to try to define the two separately, and now we're going to talk about them in joint. So if I say alternative media, I'm really talking about both, all right, unless I specify otherwise. We're looking at, according to Dews, an idea of a resistance towards this loss of social cohesion in alternative media. Now, Dews points out that this arises from, and according to other theorists, from globalization, this idea that with the rise of globalization that we're developing a unitary culture rather than having our individual cultures. This idea of individualization, which I would actually phrase as well as this idea of privatization. The fact is that we are becoming much more insular in our everyday lives. We deal with all of the expansion in communication technologies over the past century. It works out that we're actually dealing with smaller and smaller and smaller groupings of people in our everyday lives. Just another aside. At the turn of the 20th century, it was very common for men and women to be part of large social organizations. Again, I have to go back to my U.S. background, but for example, a lot of people in the U.S. a lot of men would belong to the Masons, the Knights of Columbus if they were Catholic. Women would belong to the Daughters of Isabella. All these different Order of the Elks, Order of the Oddfellows, the Lions, the Rotary. I could go down the list. Lions and Rotary, by the way, are international, and they do exist here as well as the Freemasons. And I know that the Freemasons have a lot of political baggage attached to them that they don't have in the United States. Anyway, the fact is that people would often, every night of the week, if they were in the middle class, or let's say 3 nights out of 6, have something that they were doing that was social. Nowadays, a lot of those orders have fallen away, and there's only basically, they're a shell of themselves. We don't interact the way we used to. We are very insular in our everyday lives. And lastly, Deuce talks about this idea of multiculturalism, of driving this need of resistance. We need this alternative because all the mainstream is doing is driving this idea of, it's helping to drive and or reflect this idea of multiculturalism as well. What about our local identity? And one example of this that I keep seeing, this idea about multiculturalism, it's a particular bugbear of mine, is I keep seeing on my Facebook a post on a regular basis about this resistance by majority Christians, I would say, back in the U.S. particularly, about referring to the season that runs from Thanksgiving in the United States through New Year's as the holidays. There's a big resistance to this because it's Christmas. It's always been Christmas. I don't put up holiday lights. I put up Christmas lights, and it's usually an angry rant of some sort. I put up a Christmas tree. I don't put up a holiday tree. I celebrate Christmas. So don't tell me happy holidays. Wish me a Merry Christmas. That's a form of this idea of resistance. And that's where alternative media becomes very important, because this is not a message that's being regularly portrayed in the mass mainstream media. It's showing up in places like Twitter. It's showing up in places like Facebook. It's showing up in places like YouTube. And I think that's very important to remember. And I think Deuce hits it right on the head when he talks about this. Now, Rodriguez also coins this idea of citizens media. In other words, that it's I didn't put that in there. The power of a non-commercial community media as a legitimate counterforce against transnational corporations, such as Viacom or News Corp. Now, in this case, Rodriguez is quoting McChesney and Nichols. Now, this idea of a legitimate counterforce is basically the attempt of trying to maintain this non-commerciality, issue-orientated basis, and to represent themselves in the public sphere. Now, Acton talks about, sorry, I'm just trying to find, no, okay. Sorry, I thought I put those quotes in. What I will do is I will, the quote I'm about to read to you, I'll email you because I think it's pretty important. Acton talks about this idea of symbiotic relationships. In other words, he's talking about a relationship that's dependent on the mainstream insofar as it stands as a sign of resistance to it. The alternative media, in some sense, is trying to look at itself as giving the rest of the story, as sort of giving the other side of the story. It's trying to represent itself as giving the whole story. So, for example, if you take the mainstream article plus an alternative media article, you will get the whole story. Now, Jenkins also talks about this idea, as well as engaging with this symbiosis, of looking at this idea of convergence. And in this convergence culture, you have emerging norms and values, and you have patterns of activities that blur the boundaries between media production and media consumption. Or in essence, it's a bottom-up, consumer-driven process. What he's getting at there, the idea that he's getting at, is that it's not that mainstream media is driven by factors that are much larger than the community. It's driven by ratings. It's driven by advertisers. It's driven by national concerns. Jenkins is arguing that there's a convergence going on in alternative media that allows for media production and consumption to guide each other. What is being consumed is going to be what is produced, and the producers will very often be the consumers. and vice versa. In other words, rather than having a separate journalistic guild, you might argue, like the Fleet Street set or Madison Avenue set, to look at this from a US point of view as well, you have instead the people who are creating the news are actually consuming it because it's the information that they want to know. And those people who are consuming it are very often the same actors that will be either producing the news itself or engaging in the activity. Now, another point that's going to come up a little bit later is collective collective structures as well as collective responsibility. This idea that with this convergence culture, you also have collective actions as well as a collective creation of the news and a collective responsibility towards it. Now, I've had this up for quite a while. This is because I inadvertently skipped a slide. This slide This slide has to do with where does this idea of alternative media come from. As I said, I was going to give a bit of the historical background. There's a very long history of alternative media, but some of it's not necessarily in the form that you might be familiar with today. Alternative media has been around since ancient Greek times, when there was an idea that you would engage in satire towards the political classes because freedom of speech as we know it did not truly exist in those times. So you would engage in satire. There would be jokes that would be passed around. There would be plays on words that would be put in the dramas that you would see presented. Jumping forward through this time period, it's the same thing, very similar activities within the Roman period, jumping through the Dark Ages. Looking to the more modern times, the idea of alternative media as we would understand it really began, of course, with the rise of the printing press. And one of the first forms of alternative media to arise was that of vernacular forms of the Bible. Now, vernacular basically means the Bible in your native language. The Bible was traditionally printed in Latin. And with the rise of the printing press, the church saw a massive threat to its monopoly over the interpretation of the Holy Word, and insisted that the Bible not be translated into vernacular languages, but rather require a priest to translate it for his flock. So starting in about the late 15th into the early 16th centuries, there was a massive rise in this idea of publishing the Bible in vernacular form. Now, a later example, which I finally come to this slide, is underground political cartoons. Now, this is from the 18th century. This was printed in banned literature in the in what was then the 13 colonies, which later became the United States, by Benjamin Franklin. This is basically demanding to each of the states, or each of the colonies as they then were, to join together to form some sort of united front against the British. Now, the one thing that bothers me about this is that Franklin, rather than dividing up the head of the snake, refers to New England, which is where I'm from, as a whole, whereas it was 3 separate colonies. And it's always bothered me about this. But anyway, this is an example of alternative media because it was not from a regulated source. As a matter of fact, it was from a banned source. Now, alternative media also has filled in times of crisis as well. For example, this is an example of underground media. This is the Orange Bulletin, which was published in the Netherlands during the Second World War. It was, as you can see, if you look at its values, if you were to do a textual analysis of this, as you can see, it's in very rough form. Just the headline is printed. Everything else is typewritten. And it was most likely mimeographed using a machine I think you call them mimeographs here. We call them ditto machines as well in the United States. I don't know what the correct term is. But anyway, it was done very underground, because the point was being caught with this would risk you a lengthy prison term under the German occupation or worse. So this is an example of basically wartime alternative media. Next, okay. Sorry, it's fighting with me a little bit. Here we go. There we go. Anybody here ever heard of Oz Magazine? Okay, I'm jumping forward again about 20 years. Oz Magazine started out in Australia in 1963 as an alternative magazine, sort of for the underground counterculture set. It then jumped in popularity in Australia and eventually began being printed in the United Kingdom. What's very interesting and important about it, and why I bring it up, is that it led to a libel charge in the UK. Not libel, I'm sorry. Obscenity charge in the United Kingdom. Now, the obscenity, the editors were found guilty of obscenity here in the United Kingdom. But what I found very interesting is a quote by their solicitor, John Mortimer, who some of you might be aware of if you're a fan of 70s British television. He was the creator of the book series Rumpole of the Old Bailey. Now, he stated in open court that the case stands at the crossroads of our liberty, at the boundaries of our freedom to think, to draw, and to write what we please. And why I find this important to this idea of alternative media is because there's always been within, particularly political alternative media, a sense of suppression, or an attempt of suppression. And this was one of the later examples of that suppression. What was very interesting as well was that the prosecutors were using a very old interpretation of the law that had not been used in approximately 100 years to try to find Oz guilty of obscenity. They were found guilty, they were imprisoned. Now, the case was thrown out on appeal, but it sent a very chilling force for a period of time through the alternative media in Britain, because it really said that if you're not fitting into what we want you to say, we will try you for obscenity. Now, the next sort of big change that really occurred was with the Big Issue. How many people here have picked up the Big Issue before? Yeah? Would you consider the Big Issue to be alternative media? Anybody yes? Anybody no? No? Yes? Maybe? You think it is? Why? Yeah. Oh, no, okay. Okay. It's not mainstream. I would argue that it has elements that make it alternative. For example, it's not mainstream. It's not part of larger mainstream conglomerates. It's generating news that's of a more community interest. However, one of the things that really makes it alternative is its distribution system. It's not sold at a newsagent. It's sold on the street by people who you might argue are underprivileged, you might argue. You know, it's not sold through the normal news conduits. However, one of the things that I wanted to point out, and it's why I put these together, is the other example I was going to use of alternative media at this point is that of Schnews. If you look at the Big Issue, that looks like any other sort of news magazine that you would pick up at a newsagent. However, if you look at something that's more community produced, like Schnews, which is produced in Brighton, it's a very different sort of style, and it conveys a very different message. What it's trying to do, through its style and through what it's trying to convey, is it's trying to convey to you more information. Right up at the top, you should see where its sort of interest lies. Wake up. It's your preemptive strike, for example. November 30th, we're all in it together. To hear too. It's trying to send out information that's not otherwise being talked about within the mainstream media. It's not being produced by a regular sort of production system. And this is a point that I wanted to discuss now as well. It's produced instead by a collective. And Schnews is produced in a fashion where basically it's produced by an editorial board that does not have a sort of hierarchy, as you might know it. And that's something that's very important to remember about alternative medias, is that in a lot of cases they lack a hierarchy. They act on a community or a communal principle. Now, another example that I wanted to point out is that of indie media. Now, indie media, I'm going to quote from their website here. The Independent Media Center is a network of collectively run media outlets for the creation of radical, accurate, and passionate tellings of the truth. We work out of a love and inspiration for people who continue to work for a better world despite corporate media's distortions and unwillingness to cover the efforts to free humanity. The Independent Media Center was established by various independent and alternative media organizations and activists in 1999 for the purpose of providing grassroots coverage of the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. Now, indie media works on a principle of collectivity as well as a distributed collective. Its work is based in multiple different countries. Oh, I have to wrap up. Works in different countries, but it also works on a principle that no one story gets priority over another. The priority comes from community discussions, and stories that are then brought out are brought out based on their value and relevance to others. So I want to leave you today. I'm not going to be able to run that YouTube post that I want to run. I'm actually running a bit over. But how I want to leave you today is on this. I want you to take a look when you get a chance at the Prezi, and take a look at the YouTube post that's at the very end of this Prezi. The thing that comes up in that Prezi is the idea that the Occupy Wall Street movement would never occur without alternative media. The Occupy St. Paul's movement would never have occurred without alternative media. The importance then of alternative media is this. It's a message that goes out against the single point broadcasters, against all the limitations that are placed on it through the form of single points of printing presses or of broadcasters. It's, in our modern sense, internet-driven. It's a sense of community acting against the larger corporate interests. It's not just left-wing, however. There's a lot of right-wing alternative media out there. And that's something that hopefully we'll be able to talk about in our seminars this week. However, there's a bit of an issue with the seminars this week, as you probably know. Tomorrow is a strike day. Now, for those of you who have me as a tutor, I do not cross picket lines. So I will not be on campus tomorrow. I won't be holding an office hour. I won't be having my seminars. Office hours will get rescheduled for me. Your other tutors will hopefully email you. I'm assuming you'll get an email from your other tutors based on their actions. But for those of you who have me, I won't be on campus, and I would strongly encourage you to make your voices known. If you come up to campus, please go to the picket lines. And I would strongly recommend that you look at why people are striking and what's going on. Because again, if it wasn't for alternative media, the strikes wouldn't be happening either. Have a think about that. Thank you.